he saw a meme, and he's of the new generation. And so memes are very part of the culture, his culture. And so one of the things he wanted to do was to have us market through memes. In our space, people are very, again, our customers are Boeing and Honeywell and SpaceX. And so initially the thought of marketing through a meme seemed very challenging, right? And matter of fact, the first meme he gave us to market, I'm not sure if you remember the Elmo. There's a meme where Elmo is face planting in cocaine. Right? So one morning he sends me this meme and he said, this is a perfect meme for us to use. And we were going to a trade show in Germany. Germany is again one of those places that's not they're very straightforward. So he said, we have a billboard that's on the side of a building. So it's like a 40-foot tall billboard. And he said, let's create this meme and put it on this billboard.
Welcome to the Tech Marketing Masters podcast, where we interview CMOs and VPs of marketing in tech to give you an inside look at what other tech marketing executives are up to, what's working in marketing these days, what's not, what you can try with your team, and how to level up your marketing game. I'm your host, Lee Cooper, co-founder and CEO of Cooper, of course, an SEO marketing agency that helps tech companies grow their organic search traffic. I'm joined today by Shawn Hopwood, who is CMO of Dyndrite. Dyndrite offers the software powering the future of digital manufacturing. Today, we explore a lot of really great insights, like how to focus your creativity on speaking to the right audience, even when that actively excludes later stage audiences, how to encourage creativity in your team to try new things in your marketing, even when sometimes your team might suggest ideas that might make you gag at first blush, and how to iterate on those creative ideas until they work using internal iteration and external feedback, as well as when to say no and abandon creative ideas that won't work, how to allow that creativity and experimentation to go on while still maintaining a consistent brand, and how to stay committed to your strategic vision of your brand over the long term, given your startup and your industry. Overall, Dyndrite is a really, really great case study of a very disruptive startup in a space that most people would consider a little bit traditional and straight-laced. And so if you feel like you're interested in any of this, of getting creativity in your marketing in what might otherwise be considered a traditional space, you definitely won't want to miss this episode. I guess, Shawn, welcome to the show and happy to have you here.
Glad to be here, Lee.
Yeah. Now, I know a little bit about you since, I worked for you for a little while and we've stayed in touch and that kind of thing. But for the audience here, maybe it would be helpful to give like a quick intro, sort of where you came from originally, how you got into marketing, stuff like that.
Sure. So I've been in Silicon Valley a long time. So I initially moved here from New York in the early 90s. I started a magazine for the Macintosh in 1985, just to give you a sense of how long I've been doing this. But I sold that magazine. It was a magazine for graphics, and especially 3D graphics on the Mac. But I sold that magazine in the early 90s and then moved to California, where I then joined Apple and then led the 3D graphics efforts at Apple. I was one of the first 3D graphics people at Apple in the early 90s. So I've been in Silicon Valley a long time, was an evangelist at Apple. From there, went to Silicon Graphics, which was another big company in the Valley that was doing 3D graphics, no longer around. A lot of the people from Silicon Graphics went to NVIDIA. That's now a big company, as you know. Also went to Dolby. So one of the things I wanted to do was learn audio. And so I joined up with a company that was big in audio at the time that had invented MP3, which is coding technologies. And at the time, they had developed a new technology, compression technology called high efficiency AAC, which is what we use now for a lot of the mobile audio. We got acquired by Dolby. So I went to Dolby for a couple of years and then wanted to get back into 3D graphics and turned my attention to 3D printing. And one of the things I learned when I moved back into 3D graphics or 3D printing is that 3D graphics hadn't changed in 20 years. And so I would get on my pulpit and was making a lot of talks about how things need to change. And that's when I ran into Harshal Goel, who is the CEO of Dyndrite, which is the company I'm with now, who at the time was coming out with new 3D technology to revolutionize the 3D printing space. And so I joined with Harshal, and that was about 7 years ago. And so I'm a CMO now of Dyndrite, and we are disrupting the 3D printing industry with our new software. So it's been fun.
Yeah. I guess, speaking a little bit about Dyndrite, because, I know a little bit about Dyndrite, or at least I pretend to know some of the 3D stuff going on there. Maybe if you can kind of just quickly introduce like Dyndrite, what is it that you guys are doing, and sort of, target audience, product market fit, all that fun stuff.
Sure. So the best analogy for Dyndrite is back in the 80s, a company called Adobe, you might know them, came out with a technology called PostScript. And so this is in the early 80s. And PostScript enabled printers to print what we see today, high resolution, scalable graphics, with fonts, beautiful lines, beautiful curves, Pantone colors, and so forth. So you had printing prior, 2D printing prior, but with Adobe and PostScript, now you had this incredible new scalable architecture that now has led to apps like Photoshop, Illustrator, and all the printers that we see today. So Dyndrite is very similar in the 3D space. So we've built an engine, very much like PostScript, that is a scalable compute engine for 3D printers. And so while you could still 3D print today with the technologies that exist today, Dyndrite basically makes it a much more industrial, much more scalable, much more high quality technology. And so we've fostered this new technology. We've raised funds from the venture community. Our lead investor is Google. And we've been building not only the engine, but the Photoshop that sits on top of that engine. So we have our first end user application that's about to come out in this November. And again, it's the equivalent of, Photoshop for laser 3D printers. So $1 million laser printers that produce parts for aerospace is now being run through our application. So we're an entirely disruptive new company in the 3D printing space, delivering new application development environment for both OEMs as well as end users.
Yeah. And that's a very, very specific market. Is there any way you can kind of like describe a little bit of what that audience looks like? Because I think a lot of people don't really know that space. You know what I mean?
For sure. So, if you imagine a pyramid, right, the classic pyramid. So at the top of the pyramid, you have the industrial 3D print marketplace, right, where you have metal 3D printers that are, again, making rocket parts for SpaceX, Blue Origin, Boeing. And there's probably 8,000, 10,000 people at the top of the pyramid. And then you have at the bottom of the pyramid, you have more plastic polymer printers that you would see in a school. So for example, they might, I think they sell 8 million of them a year, right? So, it's the classic pyramid. At the top, you have the industrial users, and at the bottom, you have the consumer base. So today, and then you have everything in between. You have photopolymer products, you have binder jetting products that spit out very much like 2D printing that spit out either binder or a resin that onto either a powder that then gets bound and then put into a sintering oven or into a laminate. So you have the full gamut of 3D printing uses, and our technology supports, as an engine, supports all of it. As an end application, we're only delivering something at the top end for, again, metal 3D printers. But our goal is to provide a solution for the entire triangle or pyramid.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, I mean, it sounds like overall Dyndrite is in a very new and emerging space. It's very it's a very disruptive technology in a space where it's not like you can just look to what other people have done. You kind of are the trailblazer in that space. And I'm assuming that, in some ways that's a good thing, because you get to sort of do the interesting stuff and then everyone wants to just sort of follow behind. But on the other hand, it also comes with its own challenges, of course. I always think of the old, I use this metaphor and then I don't think anyone understands it, is mushing snow. If like the Alaskan bobsled or whatever, like they have the dog sledding and they always say that the dogs who are in the front, of the dog sled, they have to mush the most snow. And so it's the most tiring for them. And all the dogs in the back, it's easier because they're already going through, like compressed snow. And so that's why they have to like cycle things out. And that's sort of the problem with being a trailblazer is you're the one mushing the snow. You have to take a lot of effort to do that. And then everyone follows behind you. So I'm just curious, like, are there any unique sort of like challenges or problems that, you've had to kind of face there? And sort of what did that look like?
Absolutely. Constantly. Right. So, the other analogy is how do you identify the pioneers, right? They're the ones with the arrows in the back. Right. So, absolutely. So 3D printing existed as an industry prior to Dyndrite, right? And and there's a promise that most people have for the technology. So currently, a lot of people, most people know 3D printing by the low, MakerBot, for example, came out with printers that you could buy and put in your home. So a lot of people really believed that was the future for 3D printing, that everyone would buy a 3D printer and put it in their home. If you know the Gardner sort of hype cycle chart, right? So things shoot up right? They get all hypey and then they crash into the trough of disillusionment. And then basically it starts to come back, right? And so when people realize that no one's going to be, not everyone's going to buy a 3D printer and put it in their home, it's sort of the marketplace shifted to industrial users, right? So as space became the new frontier, people recognized that you could make incredibly optimal parts for an industrial manufacturing role or scale using 3D printers. The problem is that the tools, specifically the software tools, were really aimed at rapid prototyping. So people recognize that 3D printers are really good for making a prototype of the part. And you can make one version, two versions of that part, and you can really, holding something in your hand is a huge step forward in the design and manufacturing process. Eventually, people said, wait a minute, well, why just make the prototype? Why don't you just make the actual thing? Well, as you move into that sort of manufacturing process, it really pushes the current software tools beyond what they're capable of, right? So just like you could make pretty pictures on a dot matrix printer prior to Photoshop and Illustrator, you could print today with 3D printers, but it's lower quality, very manually intensive, a lot of failures, and very little control over what the actual materials then the machine can produce. And so we basically decided to take it from that rapid prototyping point and move it more towards manufacturing, which means providing not only what existed today to allow people to do build preparation and so forth, but to add on new tools that allow you to, for example, control how the materials are printed, to control how, part of the value of manufacturing is you could trace things back and you have to be able to repeat the process over and over and over, right? So we basically had to create new technologies and new philosophies and methodologies that not only does the build preparation for prototyping, but enables you to repeat that process effectively and efficiently so that you could have a production part. And so that's essentially what we've done is we've added the other tools and stages necessary to basically control the process from a manufacturing perspective. And so because of that, we've made some friends, you can imagine, people who also believe in that promise, but we've also made a lot of, I don't want to say enemies per se, but we've rubbed some companies the wrong way who believe that they were delivering that solution, even though, again, they're sort of taking dot matrix technology. So Dyndrite, we build on the current rapid prototyping methodologies and then add new capabilities so that the customer can not only use the technology to prototype their parts, but actually do repeatable, traceable, high quality prints for a production process. And so in being a new company in the space, we're actually stepping on a lot of toes from companies who believed they were doing exactly that. But again, they were using sort of repurposing their existing rapid prototyping tools in a manufacturing process. And so, and there are companies that are manufacturing parts, but they're doing it laboriously. They're doing it manually. It's very tedious and it's not very cost effective. And so using a first principles approach from an engineering perspective, we built something specifically geared towards digital manufacturing, geared towards production processes, and what we call CAM, not just prototyping. And so in doing that, we've created some companies that embrace what we're doing because they understand that change is required. But then, of course, we have a lot of existing companies that view what we're doing in a threatening way, right? So we have some companies that love what we're doing and the incumbents sort of hate what we're doing. So you can imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think some of that reputation comes from, from what I'm understanding is like, you're very much the new kid on the block, and you've got some fairly, avant-garde ways of approaching things and communicating. And it probably, bleeds over into the marketing to some degree, is kind of like how you're positioned, compared to all of these more traditional, sort of solutions and companies, the traditional mindset and the traditional culture in that space. And I'm curious, like, if you had any, like any specific examples of something where you were kind of starting to go off in a completely different direction from the traditional culture, maybe with a sort of new school way of marketing, if you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So as you can imagine, right, if you're a pioneer and you're out front, you really don't have a lot of guideposts for what works versus what doesn't work. I mean, you could look back in history and sort of repeat some of those things. And we did that, again, using the Adobe analogy that I mentioned. And one of the other things is when I was with Silicon Graphics, one of the things I did was I marketed APIs, right? And so APIs, application programming interfaces. So, for example, at Apple, it was QuickTime. And at SGI, it was OpenGL. Right? These are toolkits that help you build applications. So I had some experience in building and marketing these toolkits. But in all cases, again, you're out in front. So you have to be what I like to call experimental, right? You really don't have the playbook. And so you have to write your own playbook, which means you have to experiment. So not everything that you think worked in the past will work again. Now, the good news is I worked for a really young CEO. When he started the company, he was in his 20s, and we're all gray beards, and he was smart enough to know that, hire people who've been there, done that, so that, you could invent. But one of the things he enabled us to do as a marketing team was to experiment. So every trade show, for example, we experiment with new things. All our marketing is experimental on a new level. And he challenges us, right? He's not, one of the things that just recently did is he saw a meme, and he's of the new generation. And so memes are very part of the culture, his culture. And so one of the things he wanted to do was to have us market through memes. In our space, people are very, again, our customers are Boeing and Honeywell and SpaceX. And so initially the thought of marketing through a meme seemed very challenging, right? And matter of fact, the first meme he gave us to market, I'm not sure if you remember the Elmo. There's a meme where Elmo is face planting in cocaine. Right? So one morning he sends me this meme and he said, this is a perfect meme for us to use. And we were going to a trade show in Germany. Germany is, again, one of those places that's not they're very straightforward. So he said, we have a billboard that's on the side of a building. So it's like a 40-foot tall billboard. And he said, let's create this meme and put it on this billboard. And so you can imagine the conversation where I was trying to figure out how we're going to display our brand with Elmo doing cocaine. So, right. It took, after the initial shock wore off of how we're going to convert this, this meme, we basically, took it upon as a challenge. And after iteration, we actually came up with, I think, something that worked. We had it on the billboard in Germany, and it was the hit of the show. It's a manufacturing show in Frankfurt, very classic, business-oriented show. And actually, again, it was the hit of the show. Even the show organizers held it up as an example of marketing that is different than what most companies do and how it could drive attention. And again, segment yourself away from the pack. It was incredibly successful. And we've adopted this new character, Fredo, as, something that we use on our marketing. And it's actually led to other memes that we now do. We have Meme Monday, where we put out a meme every so often. And we actually got a phone call from one of the leading companies in the space, and they asked us to help them craft a meme to tell their story. And so it's a great example of sort of imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, right? So now we see memes all the time in our space from other companies as well. Autodesk, for example, who's sort of a competitor, just recently put out a meme. It was their first one. It was kind of funny. So it definitely was a challenging thought experiment. It definitely led to some more valuable brand thought for us, and helps to separate us from the pack.
Yeah. Yeah. Because it kind of sounds like it's very much that kind of culture that would normally be considered fairly stodgy. And you're talking about engineers, a lot of gray hairs, maybe some academics from very large enterprise organizations. This is suit and tie territory.
Absolutely.
Not just like Silicon Valley, business casual is basically business formal, that kind of culture. And, in the middle of Germany, and there's a bit of a reputation for the German engineers of being, very, very correct,
Exactly.
and
very
you have, yeah. And then you come in here as total cowboys with basically a version of, Elmo doing cocaine as your brand.
Right. Well, we moved away from the cocaine, but we moved to powdered donuts. Again, it's great having a CEO that allows you that would even challenge you with something like that. And then someone who is open to experimentation, which I think you need if you're, again, out in front, because you're writing the playbook.
Yeah. I'm curious, just kind of zeroing in on that whole example for a second. You're going into this event with something that is very non-traditional for that audience. You know what I mean? I'm curious, like, were there any difficulties or any like reservations where you're thinking like, oh man, if this doesn't go well, this is going to go like really badly, or, anything like that where you had any, reservations about it? You know what I mean?
I mean, once we saw the execution, we were confident that it would come across. So there's reservation in whether people will grok it, right? Will they get it? Because a 40-foot tall billboard of a meme, sometimes you have to wonder if people get it. And sometimes you have to look at it and see the details to really understand it. And some people did and some people didn't. The interesting thing, we also served donuts in our booth. So people who saw the donuts, we then tied it into a donut giveaway at our booth. And what was interesting is it was powdered donuts. You could see, you could tie in but essentially there was a trail of white powder leaving our booth in all directions. It was pretty interesting. And you always knew the person that came by our booth because they had white donut powder all over their face. So you could, it was fun. And that's the other thing is, you want to have fun when you're doing marketing, right? Things that are fun, that are, you could make either fun of yourself or fun of the industry. It sort of, leaves a more lasting impression. And so we saw that actual ad reprinted in another magazine where they sort of showed it in, as an example of marketing, different marketing. So it's even getting a new life based on what we intended. But, we do a lot of different marketing things, right? That's just one example that we we tried something, we experimented with something, but we do a lot of other different things. For example, in some cases we go right after the incumbent, right? And so again, we have to differentiate ourselves against the incumbent. They have 87% market share, 78% market share. And so to get yourself in that conversation, sometimes you have to go directly at the incumbent. And so the other 40-foot tall billboard that we had, we created a billboard right next to their billboard, and that was by accident. And so people looked at that and they were like, oh, the gauntlet is being thrown down. So it very quickly compared us to them. People got it right away. We didn't actually, again, when we picked that billboard, we didn't even know it was going to be next to their billboard. They just happened to put their billboard up next to ours. So people was able to see this comparison, and it immediately positioned us as the competitor, and then the other billboard was the tongue-in-cheek one, which was kind of nice. So.
Yeah. Yeah. So taking some of the, like the common theme between those two is like, you're very much in a position where you're not doing just traditional marketing in a traditional market. You're kind of like branching out, experimenting, and trying some very, very different things. And, I could easily see how someone says like, oh yeah, experimentation is all good, but like, what if you ended up with a giant 40-foot, billboard that gets received really badly, or, the CEO doesn't love, or somebody has like a negative reaction to, like, how do you kind of make sure you don't set yourself, you don't end up like stepping on any landmines or setting up landmines for yourself. You know what I mean?
Well, that's where the CMO comes in. So, you have to have a vision in your head for the brand, right? You have to know in your mind whether the things you want to avoid, what are the things you want to impart. You have to have a vision for the brand in your head. Now, having been an Apple person for years, I fall back on a lot of that brand training that I got from Apple. But we always focus on the user. We always focus on trying to speak to the user and deliver things that we believe that either positions the user in a certain way or conveys something important to the user. And so we feel as long as we could focus on what the customer needs, we're in the right lane. And, we have a new ad that's coming out about mittens. I won't go into the details of it, but essentially we look at our existing product, the existing status quo is basically it limits people from doing things very precise, very detailed, and being in control of exactly what they're trying to do. So it's almost like typing on a keyboard with mittens on, right? You can imagine it's, if you had to walk around life with big oven mittens on, your precision is going to be is going to be lower than if you had all your fingers. And so we have a little commercial coming out where we have a guy that walks through life with mittens on, and Dyndrite comes through and basically takes off those mittens and enables them to basically unleash their creativity. So we try to speak to where we believe the issues the customer is facing, right? Being held back, being limited, trying to do things that they cannot achieve, and then Dyndrite being that solution that comes in and frees them and unleashes their creativity. So, So again, we try to do a variety of things that really gets across that emotional attachment to what we're trying to do.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's like, it's not about worrying about, like how the event is going to take the billboard, or how, it's not about the optics of that, because as long as you're speaking to the customer's need and you're like getting at that emotional problem and that emotional like solution for them, then you're going in the right direction, and you don't have to worry too much about the experiment, going totally off the rails or something like that, because as long as you're speaking to the customer, that's really the audience that you need to be speaking to.
That's right. And to that point, the early adopters of any new disruptive technology, right? You're familiar with the classic sort of early adopter, early majority, late majority, right? That bell curve, right? So in the beginning, you need to speak to the person or the people or the user type that's going to establish your product in a niche. And so sometimes you have to literally, avoid talking to the early majority, even the late majority, and speak to the early people who are the ones that are really going to be the people that embrace your solution and then take it forward. And so sometimes you have to ignore the other customers and really speak to the people who are the smaller audience, like we're doing, again, starting at the tip of the pyramid, right? We're going to speak to those people because they're the ones that will carry and influence the others later in the later stage of life. And so understanding their needs and speaking to them. And sometimes the message that you put out won't be embraced by the larger group, right? That's okay. You have to just focus on making sure that you deliver value to the niche or to the small group that's going to carry your message forward.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a really interesting insight there specifically. I'd never thought that through, but it's like, if you're at the early adopter stage, just focus on them. And almost inherently, that means that you're going to sometimes say some things that, like late majority wouldn't be receptive to. Well, that's not the audience, not
Right.
yet. And you only get to that audience because you went through the early adopters and then you went through the early majority. And that's how you get to late majority. So don't bog yourself down with thinking about, the optics for all these other audiences that aren't your audience yet. Focus on where you are.
Right. Because they're not going to be the ones that's going to buy. You'll bang your head against the wall, and for all sort of other psychological reasons, they're just not going to buy your product, right? Until, some influencer or some other company or some other things happen. And so let's focus on the things that are necessary in the beginning. So yeah, that's where we are. So we are, so far we've been doing quite well in attracting those early adopters. You can imagine if you're trying to make a rocket part or, hypersonics or any of those sort of cutting edge things, you need cutting edge tools. And, you're more than likely pushing the limits of the tools that you currently have. And so any tool that comes on the market that potentially solves your problem, you're willing as a company to experiment with those tools. But you can imagine if you're Honeywell or Boeing, you may not be the first adopters of tools because you have your established mechanisms and processes, and those don't really change every day. And so we have to sort of, target companies that are in themselves cutting edge. So,
yeah. I think, and there's kind of an interesting point in there as well, is that with these ads, you're very much focusing on not just the early adopters, but also trying to drive down to that emotional need and trying to get to that sort of subconscious level, need. And, for me, I'm coming from computer science and being an SEO. So I'm very analytically minded. And sometimes it's hard for me to sort of get down to that subconscious level, you know what I mean? And to get into that more emotional level. I'm curious, how do you sort of dig deeper into finding what that need is and you know what I mean? Getting to what it is that people need to feel. And not just because I think a lot of marketing teams, they know that that's something that they should do, but they know it at a top level line, and then they don't actually do it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, we've faced this all the time because, if you think about it, you could really, and we do it all the time. I mean, I'm trying to think of an example of when we've had to do it, but in some cases, you embarrass your customer base because you have to call them out, because you say, okay, you're trying to build a rocket part, but you're using popsicle sticks, right? Does that make sense? Right? In doing that. So you sometimes have to call out your customer base to say, why are you wasting your time? If you really truly are trying to be a cutting edge organization or cutting edge manufacturing, using a cutting edge manufacturing process, then why are you using popsicle sticks, right? You should be using the most cutting edge tools possible. And so you sometimes have to call your target audience out. And so there's a fine line between praising them for their decision making and taking this risk and adopting new technologies like 3D printing to manufacture parts. But then you have to call them out to say, why are you not going further? Why are you stopping here? Why are you using popsicle sticks? And so, and no one likes to be called out, right? Especially if you're an engineer and you're doing things that are very cutting edge. Our head of product spent 12 years at Blue Origin heading up their manufacturing process, right? Built their manufacturing process using additive from scratch. And he left to come here to help to deliver the tool that he wish he had when he was at Blue, right? And so you can imagine his frustration led him to leave the company and join up with us. And now he wants to bring that value back into these organizations. And you can imagine a lot of times you're up against people who don't want to change. They're stuck in their old ways. They believe they have 30 years experience doing it one way. They're not going to stop to do it some new way. And so, it could be frustrating, but I always tell my team, patience is a virtue, right? And so they may say no to you today, but they'll be back because they'll see that what they're doing is not, especially as others begin to do it, right? They'll begin to see that what they're doing is actually a waste of time and that they need to shift to this new way of working. So again, imagine if you were PageMaker and Illustrator and Photoshop first came out and you didn't have any of those tools and you were using old tools, right? And your partner or someone else in the organization was using this new tool and you're stuck on the old tool and they're producing things faster. They're making it cheaper and they look better. And ultimately, if you're an expert in this old way, you have to then give up that old way to move to this new way. So you can imagine it stings you a little bit, right? Because you feel like before this, you were an expert in your field. And now all of a sudden you're back to being this newbie using these new tools. So there's a very emotional issue that goes on there. And so sometimes we could present the opportunity and the value and people get it. And then sometimes, I hate to say it, but you got to slap them with it, right? You got to put it in there. You got to make them feel bad that why are you still doing things this old way, right? There's a better way. And so when you, again, dealing with disruption, you have to be okay with poking the bear in that regard because you can't always just be positive. You have to sort of, as our CEO says, rub their face in it sometimes.
Yeah. So. That makes sense. So, I mean, like a little bit of zeroing in on that emotional need. Sometimes, it sounds like to some degree it's that you have people, say from Blue Origin who felt the pain. They would be the customer. But on the other hand, it's not just like pulling out what the emotional need is. Sometimes it's pushing it on them. It's kind of slapping them in the face and saying like, hey, this is the way you should be feeling about it. Like you're kind of behind, there's new things. Why are you limiting yourself? And kind of you poke the bear, as you say, to get them to feel that way and then zero in on that and sort of like take them through that journey. Does that sort of sound right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, I have a saying that I've used since I started my career, which is, and I think it's a true statement, which is, technology doesn't replace people, right? People who know how to use technology replace the people that don't, right? And so there's new technologies that come out all the time. And it's, if you're stuck in the past, stuck in the old way of doing something, ultimately you'll be replaced by new technologies that come out that empower these new people to do what you used to do faster, cheaper, better, with higher quality and so forth. And so we're all going through that with AI right now, right? So embrace new technologies where it makes sense, right? And adopt it into your life and become an expert at it so that you could move faster and go further.
Yeah. Yeah, it definitely, I think that resonates, especially right now with the whole AI hype cycle going through. Well, the hype cycle, I feel like to me, there's almost two people talking past each other on LinkedIn and various social media, where there's people who are still in the camp of like, it's you use AI or you don't use AI. And then there's the people who are in the ballpark of like, look, it's how you use the AI to beat your competition. You know what I mean? It's beyond this binary kind of thing. And it's just interesting for me because like it's the same situation over here in, like SEO land, if you will, where, there are people saying, oh, you shouldn't use AI to, create content, or you should totally use AI and this kind of thing. And it's not really that the AI is replacing writers. It's that I'm finding that the AI helps accelerate the research process. It accelerates the writing process. And frankly, you can tell the difference between the companies that are using AI to at least accelerate themselves, maybe not replace a writer, but accelerate themselves, versus the ones that aren't. And like, I just happen to know the economics behind it. Like if you're using AI, you can get the cost down on that content. I'd say you can cut it by either half to 3/4 of what it used to be, which means that people are able to double or quadruple their content output. And what that causes is like, you've got the companies who are old school and they're like, oh no, AI bad, just use humans. And, it's got this motherhood and apple pie vibe to it, but they don't realize that they're not going to be replaced by AI. They're going to get outcompeted by the companies that are now 2 to 4xing their content and doing it at like half cost or, one quarter the cost. And it's like you get eaten by that kind of competition, not the AI itself. Yep. And it sounds like in your space, very much there's a similar thing going on where people are like, oh, I have the old ways, it's fine. And it's like, look, you're not going to get eaten by the new ways. You're going to get eaten by the people who know how to use the new ways. It's a completely different thing.
Well said. Couldn't agree with you more. I mean, from a marketing perspective, writer's block is real. We've all faced it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, with AI, you could just ramble in your notes, right? You could just ramble an outline and then give it to AI and say, make an article out of this, and it'll do it, right? And lo and behold, write a blog gone. So, I mean, we use AI, obviously, right? We use it for all sorts of reasons, from a marketing perspective. I've not yet been able to use AI to write a press release, right? Because it's all a lot of times based on existing what's out there already, and most press releases are introducing something new. So I've not had to use it for that purpose, but for blogs, for web copy, it's very easy to say, write this article and make sure, include these keywords. Right. I mean, it's such an easy process now that it'll do it naturally and it'll do it easily. It'll suggest to you, if you run out of ideas, it'll suggest ideas of things that you should do. So yeah, I mean, as you probably know, AI is, from a content creation perspective, is very much a very, very valuable thing.
Yeah.
Kind of would have came up with the Elmo meme we came up with, but
yeah,
but I also believe marketing is, I think one of the things that I always tell my team is like, iteration is the key to good marketing, right? It's like soup, right? Yeah. Or like a good sauce, right? You have to reduce and reduce and reduce. And iteration is critical, right? You create some ad and you sort of sit with it for a little while, and then does it work? And then you iterate on it, and you may do that iteration 5, 10, 15 times. But at some point it gets to it reduces to the essence, right? To the bare essence of what you're trying to accomplish. And it's like, okay, that's perfect. And so, AI helps with that quite a bit as well.
Yeah. I think that's like a really good point, because we're talking a little bit about, when you're in this kind of new space, you have to do a lot of experimentation, and a lot of that experimentation also kind of really hits, the sort of emotional need of this early adopter. And then from there, but like, you can't just hit it on the first try. There's a lot of iteration that's required for that. So I'm curious sort of like what that process looks like. How would other people sort of think through that process or create that iterative, process, if that makes sense?
Sure. So, I always believe marketing ideas can come from anywhere, right? It could come from person that's the office manager who's who overhears conversations and simplifies it with a very simple thought, right? So, good ideas can come from anywhere, and that's how we operate, right? There's no Like, I'm not the one responsible for always coming up with the ideas, right? We have a team of people, we have engineers, and they all submit ideas. What about this idea? How about if we told the story this way, right? So we take those ideas, and our job is to sort of, again, distill them down. And now we could apply marketing metrics to those things. Like, we sort of know, okay, these things are missing, so let's add those things on to the message, if you will. But we believe ideas can come from anywhere. And then we iterate on those ideas. And the ones that work, we continue to use. And the ones that don't work, we don't use them again, right? But we're not afraid to experiment, like you said. And because we have no idea what is going to stick and what's going to resonate with the audience. And again, the ones that do, we stick and we continue to do them. And we get rid of the ideas that don't.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. I guess, so it sounds like part of that is also creating a culture where anybody can sort of submit ideas. Like, I can see how at a larger organization or a stodgier organization or somewhere where there's like a no guy, you know what I mean? Like a guy who's just like, no, that's a bad idea. Like there's some no guy who like creates that chilling effect. But you have to have that culture where people, the idea can come from anywhere. I guess, any thoughts on like how to sort of encourage that sort of culture?
Well, it's funny because a lot of times I'm the no guy. So, I mean, having a lot of experience, like someone, okay, how did we do this? And I always try to take the idea in and then find the jewel in that idea that we could carry forward. But sometimes the idea is just either it takes too long or it would be too hard. So a lot of times you would say no to a lot of things, right? But for example, when you get a request from your CEO, right, it's hard to say no to the CEO, right? So you have to, right? So, you try to take, the ideas that you get either from product team or anyone in the company, and you try to make it work, right? But there are times that you just have to say no, that's not going to work. Or, we have a sense of, as marketing people, sort of, it has to click, right? The idea has to click, and it has to be, in some cases, obvious. If it's too nuanced, right, it gets lost on the potential audience. So there is a lot of no. I mean, a lot of things that we do throw away. Like I said, we even experiment with things that we think are going to work, and then ultimately they don't. We throw them away. So, but because you can't say yes to everything, right? And so, limited budget, limited time, limited resources. And so I try not to say no to everything, and I'm very welcoming. My team gives me ideas all the time, but you do have to be able to filter at some point what you focus your efforts on.
Yeah.
Right.
I think that's kind of the interesting part there, though, is you're saying, like, obviously you can't say, yes or no to everything, but in some ways it's filtering for, like what you said, finding the jewel inside the idea that kind of like clicks and you feel like it's going to make sense. I guess anything, any tips on like finding that jewel? Because I know what you mean, that sometimes people will give you an idea and like first glance, like I have people on my team who suggested an idea and I'm like, how do I restrain myself from saying that's dumb, but
dumbest thing
the thing is, yeah, exactly. But that there's like, they're coming from a place, right? And that place might be a good place, or like there's an idea within the idea that's worth extracting, but it's hard to like dig into it and find that thing. You know what I mean? Right. Like, I don't know if you have any tips on like how do you know when you found the idea within the idea that actually makes sense, or the thing that clicks, you know what I mean? Like, how do you know when it clicks? So
I think there's two phases to it, right? So the first phase is you have a team of people that you're working with that you want to empower, right? And so seeing an idea is stupid or dismissing someone's idea outright, right? They don't come back a second time often, right? Because they're snubbed, right? And so you sort of have to let the person boil the idea, right? So they may have to, may say, hey, that's an interesting thought. Why don't you go back and think some more of it, or talk to some more people and come back with it. Maybe you brainstorm with them, expand the team and brainstorm with the idea. And like I said, iterate. Maybe start with that initial idea and iterate upon it. Maybe, all right, so we don't show something, we show something else. So how about we try that? Or maybe that doesn't work, we try something else. The other thing we do is we go to people who are completely unrelated to what we're doing, and we present to them the idea and see if they get it, right? Because sometimes you could live in your own fishbowl so much that everything, you drink your Kool-Aid too much. You're like, this is great, where nobody else sees it, right? And so you sometimes have to go and show it to people who aren't in your field and say, does this make sense to you? And sometimes they'll give you ideas. Maybe if they say no, and then you explain to them what the original thought was, they may say, oh, what about if you showed it this way? And then, oh, perfect, that works, right? And so you iterate upon the idea. And so one of the things we do is we don't necessarily throw an idea away initially. We always, if it doesn't initially work, we iterate upon it. We share it with other people. We talk about it. And then if we get to something that works, we try it. If we never get to that point, we toss it. But I think sharing with other people, iterating upon the idea, are good ways to sort of, make sure that you're sane, right? Yet you're not the only one drinking the Kool-Aid, and other people see what you're trying to do. And whenever you get the laugh, when people see it and they get the laugh, you hit home, right? They go, oh, this is great. I totally get it. That's always a nice, when you get that impression, that's always nice.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's kind of a mixture of internal iteration and external feedback to kind of like get the idea there. And then, if you're getting to laughs or other like subconscious sort of emotional responses, you're getting there. But it sounds like, some of the ideas they don't get there, which, naturally not everything's going to pan out. Like, how do you know when it's time to stop iterating and it's like, okay, this one's just not going to work, or it's not worth, pursuing it? Like, how do you know when to kill the idea?
Yeah, again, it goes back to it's a good CMO, right? So, you fall back on your experience. I mean, you have to, I always, my responsibility is the brand, right? I represent the company's brand. And so I try to live and breathe that brand, right? And so if it doesn't feel right to me, if it feels, because you have, as a CMO, you have in your mind the vision for the company's brand. And whether you're trying to be like an Apple brand or a Microsoft brand or an NVIDIA brand or a Google, whatever the brand is, you have a vision in your head for what that brand is. And if something comes forward that is the antithesis of that brand, it sort of rubs you wrong. You hear it and you feel it internally. You know what I mean? And so don't go against your better judgment, right? Don't ever put up a billboard that you don't agree with. Don't ever put out an ad that you don't agree with, if in the back of your mind, you feel like this is just not the right thing, you have to go with that, that impression in your head. It's sort of your responsibility. And so I think any CMO or VP of marketing, you have to sort of adopt that, you have to have that internal, intrinsic, feeling about what your brand is and whether this thing that you're doing fits within the brand. Now, you could always expand the brand. You don't want to be too narrow. But again, you don't want to have something that is so left field that it's counterintuitive to the brand, or it sets a different impression off to people. And so, for example, people have come to learn that Dyndrite experiments, right? We put things out that is very experimental. So they sometimes will even give you leeway, right? They recognize that you're trying to experiment with something, and they'll give you credit for it. When we started doing, as I mentioned, when we started doing memes, there weren't a lot of memes in our space. Now there's constant, memes are constant, right? And memes are great because they're tongue in cheek, right? You could laugh at yourself. You could laugh at the industry. There's sort of, tongue in cheek, ways of communicating a point. For example, we just put a meme out where the guy was giving the finger, right? Typically you wouldn't want to put something like that in an ad, but you could put it in a meme, right? And people thought it was funny, and it became one of the most shared memes that we ever put out. So, or shared ads on LinkedIn that we've ever put out. So, people are open and receptive if your brand isn't as stodgy, and if your mold isn't so restrictive, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
You have to have some fun. If you can't have fun with it, right? Then, you're just boring.
I mean, maybe that would be very fitting for the brand of the Boring Company, but,
well, actually, if you remember, speaking of the Boring Company, do you remember one of the most successful things that they did was they put out the the flamethrower. Do you remember the
Oh
flamethrower?
yeah, Musk's flamethrower.
Right? I mean, what does that have to do with anything, right? But you put out, I mean, it's such a cutting edge, exciting. Who doesn't want a flamethrower? So, but just that little product, it has nothing to do with their company, but they put their logo on it. Everyone was putting pictures out with it, and it gave them a lot of, people were inspired by what they were doing, and it lended itself to them. They're cutting edge. They're different. They're willing to experiment and do some fun things. I think those are the things. Those are kind of fun. I mean, who doesn't want to come up with a flamethrower for their brand?
I know that you just gave me some very bad ideas there. I thinking we need a Cooper branded flamethrower, going forward.
But yeah, I mean, you just don't want to. You never want to sort of offend anyone. That's sort of always the golden rule, right? You don't want to offend anyone. Because it's really hard to come back from that, or, offend a class of people. I mean, in politics, they do it all the time, right? You talk bad about one class of people. You make some smart little comment and it stays with you, right? Even though it's sort of, so you never want to do that. And, you always want to try to have fun. You don't want to be either misogynistic or sexist or racist, any of those things, right? You want to be inclusive, involving others, and so all those things translate to marketing.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. It kind of comes back to like, when it comes to these ideas and knowing when it's a yes or a no, it's a no when it shouldn't fit the brand. It's not a presentation of the brand you want to have. And I think that a lot of that comes down to having a really strong understanding of the brand. Because I've seen marketing teams in the past where the brand was whatever was the shiny object of the week. And I've also seen, marketing teams where they had a very, very strong, central, consistent idea of like who they were and how they wanted to present that. And I think sometimes that's sometimes the difficulty is like you get creative people in the room. They always want to expand out to like more ideas and more stuff. But there is like an outer limit, before you've gone too far from the brand. But on the other hand, if you're just brand consistency, then you've railroaded people in terms of ideas, and you can be too constrictive. Like there's a balance between those two things. And it sounds like a lot of that comes down to just sort of the intuition, the feel, you sort of where what's too far, and then, what's too constrictive. And there's sort of an outer edge, that you can kind of play around with.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you could imagine a lot of, a good experiment is when you play with your logo, right? It's sort of the same thing, right? You could begin to modify your logo in ways that might have, people hate modifying their logo. And I always say to people, don't modify your logo. But sometimes you could modify your logo to help, convey a point, right? But you don't want to go too far where your logo becomes either bastardized or, people don't even recognize it anymore, right? So, a great example of sort of modifying the logo to get your point across is, so recently Apple's been putting out ads around privacy, right? And then at the end of the ad, they have the Apple logo on it. It's always been, religious, like you don't modify the logo, right? Especially the Apple logo. But in this ad, the Apple logo initially looks like a lock, right? And then it changes into the Apple logo, right? It has which gets the point across, right? So if you're able to just make a simple change like that to your logo to get that point across, right? There's no more embodiment of a point when you have your logo represent that point, right? So an Apple icon that looks like a lock gets security across, right? It means that security is important to you as the brand. And so when you do things like that, I think those are sort of acceptable things. If you're constantly modifying your logo, it doesn't have the religious connotation that it should, right? Because your logo should never change, right? It's sort of like it needs to represent, it needs to be the solid foundational aspect of your business. And if you willy-nilly change it all the time, then I think people lose the appreciation for that. But when you do it and you nail it, when you just do something simple and you nail it to what you're trying to convey, the point is really felt. So we do the same thing.
Yeah. Yeah. So you can kind of play around the edges of the brand in a way and still get that emotional, reaction. So sort of like what you were saying earlier is that, you were coming from this very stodgy-ish kind of market. You started playing around with, memes and things that normally people wouldn't do, but you can tell that it resonated because people seem to be doing that going forward. I guess, do you have any, examples of just seeing the impact there and seeing it, like, what does it look like when it works? You know what I mean?
Well, we've gone from being a very, we're again a young company. We haven't even shipped our first product. And we probably have one of the largest, well-respected brands in the space, even though people go, I don't even know what this company does, but I see their brand everywhere. And every time, what's interesting is there's sort of three words that we associate to our brand. And we consistently put out content that reinforces these three words. And the first is power, because we are very high performing. So we use like the GPU for calculation. So the performance was one of the first things that we wanted to get across. So even people that don't really know or use our product, they always say, I don't know what you guys do, but I hear it's really fast. Right. So so power is the first one. Freedom, because again, it's almost like the mittens idea. Well, it's power, freedom, and control, right? Or the three words. And so our goal as a company to free this industry and take off the mittens that have been making the status, that's the status quo today, to enable people to do more. And so we have, for example, we have an ad that's out called "You Control the Laser." And so again, we're appealing to people who use lasers to melt metal powder for their rocket parts. And so today they basically have no access to control the laser. They basically put on mittens when they send their files to the printer. And so we basically say, you control the laser, right? It's a very simple, straightforward message, but it resonates with people because they cannot do that today, right? And so the other thing is, currently in the space, when you go to print something, so you have the printer, you have the material, and you have the software. And the software that, again, the market we're in, the current software tools don't provide the user with the freedom to control the parameters of the material. So, for example, if you have a material like copper, you have to apply that one material to and the one parameter to the entire part. That's not realistic, right? In manufacturing, if you're doing like CNC subtractive milling, for example, you don't have one parameter for the entire part, right? If you're cutting the block and you're just roughing it, you're moving very fast, right? You have a parameter that's cutting a lot. You have a big tool and you're cutting a lot of the object away. As you get to the detailed parts, you go a little slower. You maybe use a finer cutting tool to get the precision that you want, the surface quality that you want, so that you could have the part that you see today. Well, in additive, that doesn't exist. If you have a part, you have to apply one parameter to that part, which means that parts come out, as you can imagine, you have to have supports to support parts that, for example, that are overhanging, where if you were going slower with the process, you wouldn't need the supports. If you want a surface quality that's really smooth, if you have one parameter and you want to go really fast, then you have to then post-process that part. Once it's printed, you have to then go with a polishing tool or miter tool and polish that thing. Well, if you can control the parameters, you could go slower when you're printing that outside so that you don't have to post-process it, right? So there's a lot of things you could do when you get more freedom and more control to print that part. And so that's what Dyndrite is bringing, is this power to do things a lot faster, to slice files that are much, multi-gigabyte files that you normally would crash current tools. You can open those parts. You could slice them any way you want. You could apply features any way you want and print files that are much more intricate, much more higher quality, and print things that you normally couldn't even print with the prior tools. So again, power, freedom, and control is our mantra. and our brand, and it applies to our brand, and everything we do feeds into one of those words.
Yeah. And so just sort of centering the brand on those three things and really kind of like focusing it in on that. And then there's creativity around those three, but
Exactly.
That's how you keep it focused.
Exactly. Right. And so we do things for example, in our space, the GPU isn't used today in additive manufacturing. Well, we rely upon it. Right. And so we do things with NVIDIA to introduce the GPU into the space. We give away GPUs at trade shows. We do side-by-side examples of benchmarks to show with and without the GPU. So people get a sense of the advantage of having, for example, in our space, it could take, in some cases, 70 hours to slice a file and prepare it for printing. With our tool, that 70 hours can go down to 20 minutes. Right. So when you have that kind of, it's easy to compare the value of something when it's that different, right? 70 to 20. So 70 hours to 20 minutes is a big difference. And so, we could get that. The power thing was easy for people to get. The other things, the freedom and control, those are a little harder. And we spend probably more time trying to convey those points.
Yeah. I can see how those are. The power part, you can just show good statistics of X versus Y, but freedom it's a feeling in a way, it's kind of, it's a little harder to get at that and have it resonate in a way. But I mean, it sounds like people are kind of like taking to a lot of the Dyndrite messaging, even though it's, very new and, experimental. It sounds like people are really kind of taking to it. And even other companies are sort of following suit, and sort of seeing from your own experimentation, I guess, just to kind of make it tangible, is there any big win where you're like, all right, that totally worked. We did the creativity, we did the iteration, we finally launched it and we looked at it and we're like, all right, people are definitely getting it. Like it's, you know what I mean? Like it resonated.
Totally. Yeah. So let me give you an example of freedom. So again, going back to the parameters, right? So again, when you buy a additive manufacturing machine and you buy Inconel or steel or aluminum as the material, what you get from the manufacturer is a parameter for that aluminum. You have to buy that parameter. So the OEM or the printer manufacturer spends all his R&D to create this parameter set, and then when you buy their machine and you buy the powder from them, they then sell you the parameter, this one parameter, right? And so that's not really freedom, right? So what we decided to do, and again, sometimes branding and marketing can be sort of not just an ad, right? It could be a whole initiative. So one of the things we did was we said, well, what about all those material companies that want to sell materials that isn't provided by the OEM? How do they sell that material? Well, what we decided to do was to create a materials consortium where we work with the materials provider to create the parameters, and then we give the parameters out for free. So, and we now work with the ASTM so that we provide the material parameter, we give it to ASTM with all the test data, and we make it available for free to the consumer. So now, instead of being held back or only able to use the parameters provided by the OEM, now you could be, if you're part of this consortium, you get free parameters from the industry. Now, the OEMs don't like that, right? Because they want to have this monopoly where they can dictate what you buy. But the issue, though, is it limits the growth of the marketplace because, number one, you can only use this one aluminum from this one company with this one parameter, and then you have to pay for it. So if you want to experiment and try something new, you don't want to spend $100,000 for this one parameter. You want to use this other company's material and experiment and create your own parameter set because you're doing something unique and different. And so that didn't exist until we created this materials consortium. And so just recently at a trade show, the day before the trade show, we launched this consortium, we put out the message of the consortium that we would develop these materials for free, these parameters for free. We invited material providers to participate in this consortium, and then we held an event. And we invited the Boeings and SpaceX's and Lockheed's of the world. And we invited we said we'd do about 50. Invite about 50 of these people. Well, about 150 of them showed up, right? And we had this huge event the day before the show. We ran out of food, we ran out of beer, we ran out of everything because it was such a hit because people have, there's this pent up demand for the democratization of these material parameters. They've been, it's like pent up demand for people being able to to freely use the materials that they want to use in the machines that they want to use. And so it was overwhelming success to the point where we met our KPIs before the show even started, right? Because in this room, we had all of the companies from across the country, even foreign companies, that resonated with this freedom message, where this democratization message, right? So again, it's not one ad per se that got that message across. It was an event and a consortium and an initiative that is, again, meant to sort of change the industry, right? So, again, being as a new company, faced with this butting up against the status quo, we could be like every other company and sort of fall in line, or we could ruffle feathers, right? We could change the way the industry does things because a rising tide floats all boats, right? So we could do things that helps the industry move beyond the black box, the you could only do it this way mentality into a more open, more free marketplace that allows a thousand flowers to bloom. So that's an example of the freedom effort that we applied to our brand, that even though we're not providing materials, we're not even providing parameter sets. We're just enabling the marketplace to use what's available on the open market, has now created a new initiative that industry is never going to go back to.
Yeah.
So again, pioneers, right? In the sense that, literally we had an OEM come up to us and said, "Why are you doing this? Why are you making these parameter sets open? You're taking money from us." It's like, our goal is not to only take, imagine the pie is this big, right? We could all sort of feed on this one little pie, or we could do things to grow the pie. And so our goal is to grow this pie and to, again, make it so that everyone is participating and benefiting from a more democratized marketplace.
Yeah. And that's a pretty, big impact. A lot of startups would love to be able to create that much impact in an industry. And you're disrupting people when all the old OEMs are coming up to you saying you're taking money out of our pockets. Like, you're having impact then,
Absolutely. Absolutely. And they'll come around, right? Because they'll recognize, they'll still be able to sell the parameters that they come up with. But now they'll benefit from other suppliers supporting their platform, and they'll eventually, and more customers coming, instead of let's say that if you had to only buy from them, an aerospace or a manufacturing company, let's say that their startup cost is, $1 million. Well, if we move this thing out of being a one-shop supplier, maybe it drops it to $500,000 or $100,000, right? So, which opens the opportunity for more people to get involved. And then if you bring more people in online, right, the market begins to grow. And so, if you're at the if you're the OEM that owns the marketplace, right, you don't necessarily feel the need to do anything different, right? And so anything that threatens your position is threatening to you. And so, hopefully they'll come around, and we think they will. So. Yeah.
Yeah. But in the meantime, kind of trying to grow that positive sum game rather than, seeing it as a fixed amount that a monopoly can take more of, But yeah, I mean, I think we've covered a lot of really good things in here, from creativity to, a little bit around iteration, some stuff around, the brand, things like that. I guess anything else that you'd say is like, big main lesson other people could kind of take away from or implement for their own teams, or at least just sort of meditate on for their own marketing teams. You know what I mean?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, everyone's faced with their own individual or personal challenges, right? And I think being really faithful to yourself of what those challenges are, right? I mean, in our case, for example, we know we're the disruptor. We have no customers, or at least we started with no customers, right? We have no track record. We have no case studies. We have no outcomes. It's all, what we're saying. I mean, we're getting to these places today, right? So people are using our product and they're getting outcomes and we're publishing those case studies. But in the beginning, right, it's all about what you're saying. So you have to believe in what, like I said, those 3 words that we have that we've had from the very beginning. And we recognize that we have to sort of bump up against the status quo, and we have to be different. And I think that each company faces that, their own challenge, right? Whether you're a disruptor or you're just trying to make a better mousetrap, you have to sort of be honest with yourself about the struggle that you're going to face and head on, face that struggle head on. Like you have to, internalize it and realize that that's what you're up against. And, and it's not going to be a winner take all day one, right? You have to nibble and chip away at what you're trying to accomplish. It's not going to happen overnight. And, like I said, we're a 7-year start. I've been in the company 7 years, right? So we're an 8-year startup, and it might take us another 5 more years to get where we actually want to be. So you have to be patient and stick with something that you think is going to work. I mean, obviously, if it's not working, you have to switch. But if you feel as if your vision is solid, your approach to accomplishing that vision is sound. Like I said, you experiment and now you have 1 or 2 things that's working, right? You may not have, like I said, with the freedom thing, we have this new initiative, but we're still doing things around the control, right? And the mittens is a great example of that, right? So we're putting out new things to get the control message across. So you have to, and it's taken us 7 years to do that, right? So I think you have to be conscious of what you're trying to accomplish, stay committed to it, and, maybe not jump around as much, throw things out that, that you think aren't working, but give it time to work. And just, have a good vision. I think have a good vision for your brand and a good vision for what you're trying to overcome in the industry. I think those are really 2 important things.
Yeah. So it's very strong, like understand your own brand, your own company, really understanding sort of, the market and the challenge that's going to be your company's unique challenge in that market. And then once you have that as a baseline and you can stay true to that and stay committed to it for many, many years, you have a strong center point for where the creativity can start from, what you can, start putting messaging around or certain experiments around. And from there a little bit of like what's still within your brand for those experiments and how to iterate it to keep it within there, as well as how to experiment. And when something is going too far from the brand and when you need to like say no to that kind of idea, because you come back to having that strong central identity and that sort of vision for the future. Is that sort of like a good summary of what you're thinking?
Absolutely. No, you did a great summation of that. Absolutely. Staying committed and true to what you're trying to do is critical. The best way to know that someone doesn't know what they're doing is to jump around too much, right? Everything is experiment. I mean, and we may start off that way, but, not everything needs to be a focus equally, right? You have to figure out where you're going to put your time, what's going to really move the needle. And then, over time, you need to embrace more things, right? So if it's LinkedIn ads or it's SEO or it's billboards or it's commercials or case studies or advertorials, there's so many different mechanisms that are out there. Figuring out the ones that are going to work for you, experimenting across the board, and then again, honing in on the ones that or keeping the ones that work and then adding to those things over time is a good strategy.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think this has been a really, really good interview, and I have all sorts of various little takeaways and things in my head I have to go, meditate on, sleep on, and I'm sure that, my audience will feel the same way. I guess really quickly, where can people, find you and your company?
So LinkedIn is probably the most direct way. Dyndrite, the company is DYNDRITE.com. We're LinkedIn. Shawn Hopwood. I noticed I don't have my last name here, but you could share my contact info, my LinkedIn. It'd be great. I'm always available to talk to anyone. I love chatting about marketing and love chatting about 3D graphics and 3D printing, as you probably know. But I love marketing as well. And I love chatting with you. I think you're doing great in your role, and I appreciate the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I appreciate, you taking the time as well and having you on the show.
Glad to be here.
And that was Shawn Hopwood, CMO of Dyndrite. You can find him on LinkedIn, and you can find his company, Dyndrite, at dyndrite.com, but that is not spelled with an E, it's spelled with a Y. So DYNDRITE.com. I'm your host, Lee Cooper. It takes me a long time to put these podcasts together, so I'd love it if you only take a few seconds to rate and review this episode in your podcast player of choice. And if anything really stood out to you, tell me whatever you liked the most or even least about this episode at lee@cooper-marketing.com. I'll see you next time.